Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer from the Department of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I'll be the host for today's program. Joining me is our usual viewmeister, Felix Brooks, who's the Officer of Diversity and Inclusion at Kalamazoo Valley Community College and also the Director of their International Admissions Office. And joining us today as a special guest is Paul Clements. Paul is a professor of political science at Western Michigan University and a recent candidate for Congress in the 6th Congressional District. So welcome, Paul. Glad to have you with us today.
Thanks, Ron. Nice to be back.
I think we were all shocked at the outcome of the election. The last show that we did, we made a prediction that Hillary was going to pull things out. I think I said she was going to drive down for a fourth quarter late touchdown to win the game, but that didn't happen. And so we have President-elect Donald Trump, and that was something I don't think too many people thought could happen when this whole process started. It was a very strange election season, I think, all the way around. So let's start with the question, how did he win? What happened? Paul, what's your take on the outcome of the election? How did it happen?
Well, it was kind of a crazy election year from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And, you know, I know that we've been talking about this already, and you've used the word resentment, that he stoked up a lot of resentment.
Yeah.
He also told a lot of lies, and he, you know, insulted a lot of people, and but somehow he spoke to a sort of a visceral feeling that a lot of people have that the system is not working for them, and unfortunately a lot of people responded to that.
There was a lot of focus on the white working class, Felix, and that the politics of resentment is the term that's often been used. What was your take on the white working class vote, and to what extent was that an expression of their feeling of being left behind economically, and then what part of that do you think was attributable to a kind of underlying racism? What do you think?
I think there's a little of both. I talked about this before. In 2008, after Obama got elected, I went on a trip out to Phoenix to visit one of my friends out there, and I happened to be at an athletic facility that was at that time in Mesa, in Scottsdale, Arizona, so a pretty exclusive suburb. And I was in a stall, and these guys came in the bathroom and they were talking, and it was the first time I'd heard somebody say something about we need to take our country back. And that conversation always stayed with me, because I knew what that meant. There was a sense of resentment on the part of the fact that, as Bill Maher said, that some folks could not wrap their heads around the fact that an African American person had become president. And I didn't think that resentment was going to go away. And then along comes Donald Trump, who takes all the filters off and speaks directly to that group, you know, with respect to African Americans, with respect to Muslims, with respect to anybody that was different. And he does it in such nationalistic tones, it resonated with that reservoir that had already been built up. He said, I can come, I can save you, I can make this country great again, which to a lot of African Americans means make it whiter again. That's what the code words are for them when they hear that. So, you know, that magical time between 1945 and 1960, when America was, you know, the best and brightest generation. Well, if you were a minority or a woman during those times, those weren't exactly great times. And so I think he spoke to that group of folks, and it resonated with them.
Paul, the last program we did, we talked about the distinction between right-wing populism and left-wing populism. And that left-wing populism is a kind of economic populism that's usually directed at the structure, at the elite, if you will, the 99 versus the 1%. But right-wing populism seems to be a kind of populism that redirects the resentment at others who have stepped in line or who have taken someone else's place at the table. And so the anger and resentment gets directed at others, scapegoats. And so maybe that's part of where the racism comes in. Do you agree with that kind of analysis? That's John Judas's analysis, the left-wing populism. Right-wing populism, does that ring true to you as an analysis?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment, both in general of the difference between left-wing and right-wing populism. And also, let's be clear, let's look very specifically at, you know, we're talking about Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders said from the beginning that he's addressing money in politics and economic inequality, and also climate change. And if you look at Trump's campaign all the way through, he was insulting, Hispanics and Muslims, and saying that, he was going to bring back the jobs and not allow these big companies to take those jobs away, and just making claims directly to many of the very specific sort of blame this person, blame that person, blame that group for what you're hurting from. But I'm sure I wasn't in the last discussion, but part of the challenge we face right now is that right-wing populism that Trump has represented, unfortunately, he also sold them a pack of lies in terms of what he can do about it. If we look at the government that he's putting together and all of the things that Bernie was talking about in terms of increasing economic inequality, more money in politics, the politicians responding more to the wishes of the big donors, I think that rationally, we've got to expect a lot more of that, given the people that Trump is putting together, given the way given the kind of election he's run.
So Bernie tapped into some of that white working class anger at their economic condition also.
He certainly did, yeah.
But do we have to lay a lot of blame on the Democratic Party or on Hillary Clinton? I mean, where do the Democrats come in? Could they have more effectively, addressed those white working class concerns in a way that directs it not at scapegoats, but at the structure and the economic and political conditions?
If we take this back to Bill Clinton and his sort of reformulation of the Democratic Party back in the 1990s, he sort of brought in this sort of new Democrat, we're kind of going to be for working people, but we're also kind of going to be for the economic elite. And I think that there's a sense, and that there's some justice in it, that has gone too far. That the Democratic Party, to some extent, we had all this anger at Hillary's speeches on Wall Street, and she did make those speeches, and she wasn't entirely forthcoming about what she had to say about that, and that was certainly what Bernie was responding to, that we've got to get the Democratic Party working for the working people again, in a way that unfortunately it really hasn't been in recent years.
And the biggest strength of the Democratic Party had been its diversity in 2008 and 2012, and this past election, it was its biggest weakness because it seemed fragmented in a lot of ways. And there was no way to coalesce a message that was going to bring everybody in. Plus, they didn't get the same turnout that Obama got. And who could expect that to happen? I mean, demographically, if you look at the maps, where she won and where she lost at, she did get a large percentage of the vote, but it was not as large as Obama got. And there were more people came out in the rural areas to vote and voted in favor of Trump. And areas that had voted for Obama in the past voted for Trump. He got a lot of those, quote, Reagan Democrats to vote for him across state lines.
Yeah.
Far beyond places like Michigan, but in Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina as well.
Yeah, I think we should point out that at the current moment, Hillary has about a 2.5 million vote lead in the popular vote. But of course, it's the Electoral College that determines the outcome. And I guess I was most surprised that Hillary lost Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. If she had won those 3 states, if she would have held on in those 3 states, which I thought going into the election were maybe closer than I would have liked.
That was supposed to be her firewall.
I thought that was her firewall, and so, but that didn't happen. So it was a downturn in turnout among African Americans, and an upsurge of voters in the white working class. Is that what tipped those states, do you think?
And I wouldn't consider it a significant downturn in African Americans. I just don't think as many who came out to vote for Hillary as voted for Barack Obama. But you have to expect that to be the case. A lot of folks, that was their first time ever voting for somebody African American in the 2008 and 2012 elections. This was more of a status quo election with respect to that. So
so was Hillary just the worst possible candidate at the worst possible time? I mean, given that her husband had been president, that they were tied into a kind of right turn in the Democratic Party, that Republicans had spent a decade or more building up huge ammunition to throw at her. And then on top of that, you had the email controversy. And again, for many women, it was incredibly empowering to have a woman running for president. But was Hillary just too damaged of a candidate, do you think, Paul? What's your take on that?
I think if you're going to say the worst possible, that's a little bit too strong.
Yeah, okay,
That's kind of
okay.
strong, you know.
Okay.
That certainly she was not the inspiring candidate that Barack Obama was. I mean,
Yeah.
there's just no question
No.
about that. But it's also true that there's been this right-wing media that doesn't care about the truth, that has been sowing distrust for so many things that, you know, it's not as though they're zero, but, you know, where Trump's lies are like 90%, you know, and Hillary's, okay, maybe 10%.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
they jump on those, and they built up a whole story around that. And there are so many people who are saying, you know, I just don't trust her. I just can't vote for because I don't trust her. And I don't think that, I mean, it's not that she's blameless, but unfortunately, I mean, I think we need to kind of step back a bit and say that this election represents a real blow to our democracy. I mean, sure, it's democracy in the sense that we had an election and people voted, but in terms of if we're talking about government of and by and for the people and just political discussion based on reasoned argument and having a discussion that's actually going to allow for real differences in policy, for what's really going to make a difference for the people of this country, for our future, that just didn't happen.
All that went out the window. I mean, because the things that Trump did would have disqualified any other presidential candidate along the way. Any of those things that he did would have disqualified that person as being a candidate, and he was able to move past all that. Not only in the primaries, but in the general election as well. Nothing seemed to stick. And the question is, were people so hungry for a change that it didn't matter what he said or what he did? Because he's got all this baggage. And that baggage that he brings to the White House is very real stuff that people are going to pay attention to. But it didn't seem to matter to the electorate. People have voted for him in spite of all those things.
Yeah, in spite of all the things that came out, the things that he said. So do you think it was just there was such a strong desire for change and to, Hillary was a politician and Trump wasn't a politician, and so was that one of the deciding factors, just this overriding desire that we got to shake things up?
Yeah, I mean, if we look historically, I mean, usually when you've had one party as it was in power with presidency for 2 terms, most often, you know, it goes to the other party. That's been the historical pattern, and that's partly just a desire for change, and that was certainly part of it. It's sort of also then with the desire for change, a particular feeling that the political establishment, you know, is not working for us. But kind of the ironic thing is, well, now we look at, you know, who's coming into the government, and both in terms of the economic establishment that Trump was bashing throughout the campaign, and also someone like Reince Priebus and, you know, some of these people who you couldn't find someone more establishment than him.
Right.
But so in terms of moving forward, it's going to be, well, I think both interesting, and I'm kind of sad. I'm kind of, you know, pretty worried about this. But nevertheless, it was that anti-establishment feeling that that Trump rode.
And it's one of those, be careful what you wish for. I mean, we've seen with his appointments, they tend to be their establishment types. They're people who are Wall Street types. He's talked about draining the swamp, but he's not replacing it with anything that wasn't already there.
Right.
The names have changed, but as far as the backgrounds and the outlook politically, not much different. You know, the folks that he's bringing in to run the Treasury Department or, you know, head up his, you know, economic advisors, it's the same cast of characters. Nothing radical is done there.
So we're getting Wall Street people coming in. We're getting very strong ideologues. I think the thing about, I mean, we do have some evidence now where Trump might go, and I think if we look at the cabinet appointments, right now he's just opening the door wide open for all kinds of corporate influence and for right-wing ideological influence to come in and shape the direction of his administration. And I don't think that's what people were counting on when they voted for him.
That wasn't what they asked for. That wasn't what he sold, but that's what they bought.
Yeah,
And you know, we're talking about oligarchy. We're talking about rule by the wealthy. And you know, he has the wealthiest cabinet we've ever seen in history. And the idea that these, you know, Wall Street people, that somehow, you know, they're not going to be trying to make policy that's going to be helping their fellow bankers, their fellow corporate CEOs and you know, shareholders. That's just, if that's what you think, you know,
Yeah.
you ought to think again.
Yeah, they don't.
Yeah.
They, those people don't care about the white working class, and that's going to be you know, pretty strong revelation to these folks down in the years coming out. That folks who expected they were going to get something back from the government, it's not going to happen that way.
And then we have people like, I forget the name of the Health and Human Services appointee for heading up that, this doctor.
Price. I think.
Price,
Yeah.
that's right, thank you. And you know, if you look at his history, he wants doctors to do well. Well, I mean, my goodness, the average income of doctors is already so much higher
Yeah.
than for most of us. And the kind of reforms that he's been talking about are reforms that are going to strengthen the position of doctors and frankly strengthen their incomes. You look at Betsy DeVos for education, and she has a history of supporting for-profit charter schools that here in Michigan,
They've done
where
miserably.
we've done
Yeah.
miserably, but where there've been, you know, pretty significant corporate profits. And so if you look at what's going to happen in healthcare, that thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands, are going to be thrown off their health insurance. What's going to happen in education? A lot of public schools are going to be hurt. You know, who goes to those schools?
The most marginalized of our populations, you know.
I mean, when you have these tax cuts for these billionaires, they talk about trickle down, but the evidence has been so clear for so long. Trickle down does not work. I mean, come on.
You can go back to Reagan in the early 80s to show that.
Trickles
yeah,
down
Right.
from their pocket to the pocket of their heirs. That's about it. That's about
Right.
as far as it trickles down. So.
Well, we also have one other very concrete case of how Trump might operate now, because yesterday they announced that Carrier Corporation in Indiana is going to retain some of the jobs that they had planned to ship to Mexico, and Carrier is owned by United Technologies. And so Trump had made that sort of an issue, and he is now crowing that he's coming through with his promises to save those working class jobs. But when we look more closely at that deal, what seems to have happened is that Carrier Corporation was granted some significant tax breaks by the state of Indiana and some promise of regulatory relief. And in exchange for those goodies, they're now going to save maybe half, probably not half, but maybe up to half of the jobs that they did plan. They're still planning to ship some of those jobs to Mexico, but they might hang on to some of them. So, and the president personally involving himself in negotiations with a corporation in that way. So what do you think of that deal, Paul? What's happening here? Is that what, again, the Trump supporters were expecting to get to save their jobs?
Well, if you look at the, I was getting my oil change. I don't usually watch a lot of Fox News, but there was Fox News going on in the auto shop, and there was one of the people who'd been slotted to lose his job, and you know, he was thanking Trump on television. And I think that there will be quite a few people who will see it that way, and that we have to acknowledge that Trump is a past master of the media game.
Yep.
And now, and looking forward, he's going to be continuing to develop his, you know, America first, working class rhetoric. But what we see in this particular deal is the real beneficiaries is going to be the Carrier owners and shareholders.
Yep.
They're the ones who are going to get the most by a significant margin out of this deal. And if we look at moving forward, I mean, this is one where he can sort of waltz in, you know, on a white horse and say, you know, I saved your job. But as we move forward with broader policies, these things are going to have consequences that are going to come back to bite him. Like if he does talk about, you know, raising the tariff for China by 35% on certain goods, well, China's going to respond to that.
Yeah.
And those responses then will have consequences for employment and for prices here in our country. And frankly, you know, the long-term effect is going to be harmful to the majority of workers. So part of the interesting issue here is that we've got to recognize the depth of this disaster for our democracy. And frankly, if we look at democracy worldwide, it's not in the strongest position
not at all.
right now. And this is encouraging these right-wing, populist ideologues, frankly, around the world. And this is a time when anyone who cares about where this country is going, if we want government of and by and for the people, it's going to be going in the opposite direction in serious ways. And I'm going to say, we Democrats and the citizens of this country, as we see the evidence of this coming down the pike, we've got to let people know, remind people, let people know it, so that they're not fooled by the Donald Trump media game that we know he's going to play. And say, look, this is what's happening. This is how it's affecting you. This is how it's affecting your family. And if we want that to change through the democratic process, we've got to be building the Democratic Party from the bottom up, from the grassroots up. And that's one of the things that I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
And that is to say that the Democratic Party has, to some extent, gotten to be a distance away from its foundations.
So it's forced to reset in a lot of respects. But with respect, back to the carrier situation, I was listening to a representative from the state of Indiana say that these are manufacturing jobs. They still only represent a tiny iota of our economy. He said it's very small. He said, not to mention the fact that there are a bunch of other smaller factories that are going to be shipping jobs off to Mexico. And he's not coming to rescue any of those folks. He just comes in and makes a big splash. It's a big press opportunity, but it's still 1,000 jobs are going to go. And then at what price? It's not like he waved a magic wand and the carrier said, well, we'll keep these jobs here. No, Carrier got something out of this deal. They got a lot out of this deal.
Yeah, and Trump's idea was that I'm going to come in there and I'm going to force them to stay. I'm going to threaten them that there are consequences if you take jobs out of the United States. But what were the consequences here?
Tax breaks.
Sounds like a pretty good deal for Carrier,
Yeah,
you know, threaten to leave, and here comes Donald Trump offering you all kinds of goodies and tax breaks and regulatory relief. Well, why won't other corporations now also play the same game? If they threaten to take jobs out of the country, is Trump going to come in and offer them all kinds of goodies to stay? And who does that benefit in the long run? I mean, as the taxes on corporations decline even further, who makes up that tax base? And it's not going to be a pretty sight, I don't believe. So. I did want to go back to one other issue from the campaign, because I want to get you guys' opinion on this, and that is the role that Comey and the FBI played late in the campaign. We talked about Trump being somewhat of a Teflon candidate, right? That, I mean, he basically admitted that he committed sexual assault, and even that didn't seem to resonate with anybody among his voters. And of course, many of the other comments that he made. But the email scandal with Hillary Clinton, which I don't think anybody really understood very well, but it was sort of something nefarious out there that she had this private server and somehow she had revealed classified information somehow through her emails. That was sort of the game out there. But late in the campaign, the FBI director comes out, what it was, 10 or 11 days before the election, and says, well, now we're reopening the investigation into Hillary's emails, and that did seem to have a pretty dramatic impact. So, Felix, what was your take on that? I mean, it's pretty unprecedented for the FBI to involve themselves in the election in that way.
Historically has always had the mandate to not get involved in politics. And I think Comey had to know, and if he didn't know, he should have known, that what he did there directly injected the FBI into politics. Because they didn't have anything tangible.
No.
He sends this letter to the Congress saying, you know, we're going to do further investigation, but they didn't have anything. And by the time he comes back, as I'd say on page 3, a week and a half later, said, there's nothing there, the damage had already been done.
Right, yeah.
I mean, I really couldn't understand what his motives were in that. The FBI usually doesn't come out and make those kind of statements unless they've got something tangible, and they didn't have anything.
Yeah.
So it seemed like it was deliberately timed to inflict damage on her campaign. And I can see why they have some resentments towards him, towards what he had done.
Yeah.
Because it just didn't make any sense to me. If there was a smoking gun, that's one thing, but there was no smoking gun.
Yeah, there was no there.
And it turns out that all the emails they found were emails they had already seen. They just happened to be on this guy's, Anthony Weiner's laptop.
Yeah.
But it was nothing they hadn't already seen.
Yeah.
And for them to say something ahead of time without doing a thorough investigation, to me, just smacked of partisanism to me.
Yeah.
And if we look at how that played out and the extent to which Comey's so-called revelation dominated the media
Yeah.
for the whole week, in just in less than 2 weeks before the election, what that meant was that the real discussion about the consequences of this election for the people of this country couldn't be front and center the way it really ought to be for a presidential election.
And given how close this election was, I can see in certain states how that swung people who were on the fence to vote one way or the other. It helped some people make up their minds, especially when you look at the margins in North Carolina and Michigan and some of the other states where you're talking less than 2%.
Less than 1%,
Less than 1%
less
of
than half a percent.
I can't see where I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that had to have an impact on some of those people making their decisions as to how they were going to vote. That was just one more nail in her coffin in that narrative that we can't trust her.
Yeah, it certainly reinforced that line. So let's look now at a couple of areas where Trump has made some pronouncements, and we may have reason to be very fearful of where policy is going to go. And Paul, let's start with an issue near and dear to our hearts, which is climate change. Paul and I both work at with the working group on climate change at Western Michigan University, and both of us have written about this topic and very much involved with it. So what do you think is going to happen? At one point, Trump said that climate change was a hoax, something created by the Chinese. What can we anticipate with is he going to withdraw from Paris? I mean, what's going to happen?
Well, it's in terms of the legalities of Paris, it would be very hard for him to withdraw within 4 years. However, Paris doesn't have any teeth to start with. So I really think that the likelihood is, and that we're not going to see, that we're going to see the United States pulling back. We're going to see, he's talked about increasing oil and gas production, climate pollution production here in the United States. And he's talked about withdrawing from the United States commitments, and whether that's withdrawing from the treaty or just not doing the things that United States had committed itself to, which he can just do by himself. And if you look at who he's putting for managing the EPA transition, is it Ebell?
Myron Ebell.
Myron Ebell.
From the
oil and gas
competitive.
industry.
My goodness, he's a climate science denier.
Yeah.
And this is something, and we've talked about these things many times, and that is to say that we should be far ahead of where we are right now in addressing climate change, and in terms of the consequences that all the scientists have said, we've got to stop warming before it gets to 2 degrees Celsius. Well, the existing assets of the existing oil companies are far more than if all that oil is extracted and burnt, that's going to take us past 2 degrees already. And so he is encouraging more drilling. He's encouraging more exploration that is just far exacerbating the problem. And if we think about the consequences of this, one of the difficulties is that there are a lot of these thresholds, and because we've already got carbon dioxide more than any time in the development of the human race. We've already got it 400 parts per million, more than the past 2 million years. And so we've got the science that's kind of predicting where this is going to go, but the science can't tell us specifically and clearly. That says, well, we might see a much more rapid melting of the ice, of the snow on the ice in like Antarctica and in Greenland. And so, we can predict that we'll have, maybe 60 centimeters to 1 meter of sea level rise in this century, which would be terrible. Which would be, we lose a good part of Florida, New Orleans.
Say goodbye to New Orleans, yeah.
Right. But on the other hand, the science isn't quite there, but maybe it might be 3 meters. Oh my goodness. My goodness. If we set things in motion in these, Trump could set things, he could do it. He could set things in motion in this 4 years of his presidency that leads us, instead of 1 meter, that leads us to something like 3 meters. And that's really frightening.
And those
That
consequences
really
will
scares
reverberate
me.
over generations. And that's why this is such a dangerous time.
Right.
Because the impacts that we're going to see might not show up for another 20 years, but when they do show up, they're going to be much more devastating than they would have been if we had put the brakes on now.
Exactly, exactly. And I can understand that, you know, if you're sitting in your living room, that something 20 years away down in Florida doesn't seem like the most pressing concern if you're losing your job. But my goodness, we have to be responsible for these things. And these things, you know, that it's our children and our grandchildren, it's people around the world. And this is a threat that is unprecedented. And so for people not to be able to get their minds around an unprecedented threat, you know, I can get that. I can get that, but we expect our leaders to take account of science. And this is part of why, you know, it's when we talk about our democracy being in trouble, it's not just oligarchy, it's also truth.
Yeah.
It's also facts. I mean, having some guy look at how he campaigned. I mean, he campaigned, what they say, a lie every 3 minutes, something like that. And you know, I'm not so worried about what's going to happen in the next 3 months. What I'm worried about is as the chickens come home to roost with some of the bad results of his policies, and he starts to feel threatened, and then when he's got the power of the presidency, when he's got the power over the FBI and the CIA and so on, and when he's got these, you know, to some extent, white supremacists, when he's got certain groups in the population who see him, whether it's true or not, they see him as their candidate.
He's a standard bearer for them.
He's their standard bearer, and he knows how to drum up that type of anger. And so what I'm worried about is when he starts to run into trouble, and then we see the antics of the campaign and the anger and the violence mongering of the campaign. That's when I'm worried it's going to come back.
And that's the part that I think his admiring of Vladimir Putin comes from, because that's the same sort of visceral circle that surrounds Putin. When the enemies come out, he's stoked up enough resentment in the population that people will take care of these things for him, and he can keep his hands clean. And I see the same thing happening with Trump.
And so, you know, if we're talking about the situation of minorities, of African Americans, of Hispanics, that if he's stirring up that kind of anger and resentment moving forward, you know, that's when, and I know that we've talked in the months prior to the election about, you know, there are shades of fascism in Trump's candidacy, and that's our closest historic example of what we're moving towards. And that's something that I think all citizens should be deeply concerned about.
Because I tell people, you know, the folks who voted for him, can't separate him from all this other baggage. They like to intellectualize all that stuff away, but you can't do that. You don't have the luxury of doing that. When you voted for him, you took all this baggage with him. And you saw that on display last night at the sort of press opportunity he had when he was railing against the press. Talking about how dishonest they were, pointing at him in the back of those guys back there, they're just the dishonest press. Whose resentment is he stoking when he's saying that, you know?
Yeah, the environmental issue to me represents, I mean, of many, many serious threats, perhaps the greatest threat of this presidency, because we are at a point where I think you and I would argue Paris was an important step forward, but it still was not where we needed to be. And I know that you believe, as I do, that we're not going to really get a handle on the climate change issue unless the United States plays the leading role. Historically, we were the greatest emitter of greenhouse gases. We've fallen behind the Chinese in that regard right now, but still, we have a historic responsibility, and the United States' role as the leader in the international community means that it has to take the leading role here. And so if now in the United States we have a climate denier as president, and who was just appointed, this man Myron Ebel, who from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is one of those right-wing think tanks that's been engaged in climate denial and has taken corporate money from ExxonMobil and other corporations to engage in this climate denial. If these are the people now that are going to be in charge of environmental policy, then we know that the United States is not going to take that leadership role. And so the climate change issue and many, many other environmental issues are just going to grow greater and greater. And to me, this is, among all the threats, perhaps the greatest threat of the Trump administration.
And yet, strangely enough, the Chinese appear to understand that, and at least in the rhetoric they're using now, that they're willing to at least step forward and say, we're going to stick with the targets that we promised. We can only hope that that's the case.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, though, that to be honest about this, the targets that China promised were targets that they pretty much already needed to make, given the rise of pollution that they've already been seeing across their country. So, they did make commitments, and it was critical that they should be part of the deal. But we were talking before about Trump's trade policy and what he's doing with this company and about supporting companies. And this is something where I think, as we look at both climate change and the economy moving forward, it's important to bring together. And I want to take it back to the economic discussion. The traditional discussion has been between free trade and protectionism. And that's the framework. Those are the narratives that are just out there, that people tend to see as one or the other. And frankly, Trump is a traditional protectionist. He's taken us right back to just slap the tariffs on them, and don't allow the exports. But if we look at economic policy moving forward and where successful economies have been going, and here I'm going to use China as one example, because they've figured out that because of climate change, we are going to be seeing a dramatic increase in sustainable energy production. And they know that if they're producing these solar panels, if they're producing the windmill parts, that they're going to benefit economically from that. So they, the so-called communist government in China, because they have predominant private ownership of their factories. It's a capitalist country with a communist party authoritarian leadership. But given that they, they're playing the game, and they're working to increase production of clean energy technology because they see that as a winning economic game. This is what our government ought to be doing in terms of the economic intervention. We should be seeing where are those sectors where there's important future growth, and not just giving tax benefits to those companies, but saying, look, we want to see you increasing your production. We want to see you increasing your employment. We want to see you improving your technology. If you work to hit these targets, then we're going to support you. Or we'll support you, but support you only if you don't achieve the targets, that support's going to be withdrawn. That's the kind of thing we see China doing, and it doesn't fit the traditional free market protectionist dichotomy, but that's kind of where they're moving forward.
And they'd like to see nothing more than us recede as the leaders of the world as far as that goes, and so they can be, so that the other countries in the region can be more dependent on them from a trade perspective as well.
And let's be very clear. If we talk about the future of democracy, if we talk about our human liberties, a free press, individual rights, are these going to be sustained in the future? China is not the standard bearer.
No, not at all.
That you want.
No.
So again, let's be clear how serious the situation is that we face today. That American democracy, domestically and internationally, in terms of our international influence, is in deep trouble with President-elect Trump. And unfortunately, we're going to be seeing this playing out, these consequences playing out in coming months and years. But for me, the consequence of that is, let's talk to our listeners that, look, if you care about the future of our country and the world, if you care about women's rights, minority rights, climate change, if you care about individual liberties across the world moving forward, if America loses the mantle of democratic leadership, then we're in deep trouble. And how do you, if you do care about that, what should you do? It's got to be the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is the only institution that can build the political strength to turn around the things that Trump is moving towards. I mean, yes, support your group. There are going to be a lot of victims of the Trump presidency, And we need to have solidarity and support for those victims, because that's just basic humanity. We need to have that. We need to prepare for that. But if we want to make a change, the change is only going to come through the political process, and the political process is only going to be driven, as far as I can tell, by the Democratic Party. Excuse me. And so we've got to be building the Democratic Party in the months and years to come.
How do the Democrats do that? What does the Democratic Party have to, what lessons does it have to take away from this election, and what kinds of changes does the party have to make to do what you just asked it to do?
Well, there's two things that I would say. And one is, if we it's easy to frame the question of, are we looking at the Democratic Party moving in the Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton direction? And I think the answer is very clear. We've got to move in the Bernie Sanders direction. But he had a very clear, progressive analysis of the problem, and I had some concerns about Bernie's ability to fulfill his promises.
Right.
I had concerns about that. But in terms of articulating the problem and the direction, he was right on target. He was right on target. And the Hillary Clinton branch of the Democratic Party has not been there. So we need to be going in that, and that's what I want to see nationally. But let's be clear that it's got to be building up from the grassroots as well. And whether it's African Americans or Hispanics or gay and lesbian, or people who would like to have health insurance, or people who care about education, all right? These are the people who many of these groups have not been politically involved. They were not enthusiastically coming out to get out the vote, and that's what we've got to build for as we move forward.
And I would echo that. For one, the Democratic Party has to oppose Trump anywhere and everywhere he's engaging in policies that I believe are anti-democratic. But as Paul said, they also have to be willing to build too. Recognize that the base that we have right now has to be spread out, and has to be much more focused on what the mission is going to be moving forward, and bringing more people into that tent and getting people involved at the grassroots level, at the granular level.
And we haven't even mentioned the labor movement.
Yeah.
Imagine getting this far in discussion and not mentioning the labor movement.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's partly because, the labor movement has just taken so many hits, and they're going to take more. But it is the labor movement that brought us Social Security, with FDR.
Gave us the middle class.
It gave us the middle class. It gave us the 40-day working week that helped to bring women into the workforce. And if the labor movement is further decimated, then that's going to be pushing this gap between the rich and the poor even further. It's going to be supporting the possibility for just oligarchy. And so that's got to also be, part of this coalition that we're working from moving forward.
I think clearly the weakness of the labor movement provided a huge opening for Trump to swoop in and deal with those people, because they didn't have an organization that would allow them to analyze the situation, the economic conditions, and to mobilize in a way that would have maybe pushed them in a different direction.
Yeah.
And that would probably more significantly address their concerns.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to foreign policy, because so many issues to deal with. But where do you see a Trump foreign policy? Now, Trump was somewhat incoherent, I think, during the campaign about foreign policy, and still very incoherent. He did seem to strike a kind of anti-war stance on occasion, because he would say, well, I was against the invasion of Iraq, which he really wasn't, but he kept saying that he was, and that Hillary voted for it, and that the generals don't know what they're doing. He knows more than the generals about how to. So he did strike some critical chords there. But then on the other hand, he's talking about, well, we're just going to wipe out ISIS, we're going to bomb the heck out of them, and he struck a very belligerent stance in other ways. Then he talked about bringing back torture. He also talked about, ending the nuclear weapons deal with Iran. And so he struck some very aggressive, strident tones, and on the other hand, he made some feints toward a different direction. So where do you think we're going to go with a Donald Trump foreign policy? What's going to happen? Felix?
I see it being very schizophrenic, and I see it being very situational, because that tends to be how he reacts and does things, depending on the situation that he finds himself in. So he may have a policy that says we're going to go in and bomb ISIS in Syria, but this whole situation with Iran is going to be much more nuanced. He can say we can cut out of that deal, but there are other parties to that deal who are going to say, wait a minute, not so fast. Same thing with Cuban policy. He wants to do this, but not so fast. And I think he's going to realize once he gets involved in these policies that it's not going to be as cut and dry as he'd like it to be. It's not that simple. The world out there is much more complex.
And when you say schizophrenic, I know you use it as a turn of speech,
Yeah.
you know, but let's be clear that the nature of relations with other countries around the world, the nature of the challenges that the United States, that we face in our relations with other countries, involve complicated relationships. And you need a clear head. You need to have a clear vision. You need to be working out a strategy that you can implement, you know, through a team over a period of time. And all the evidence is that his temperament and disposition, and you look at the team he's coming together, we can come back to that, but that it'll be very difficult for him to develop just this thoughtful, careful analysis, whatever the strategy is, whatever he wants to do. So yeah, when you talk about sort of having a schizophrenic at the helm, that's kind of a frightening thought, but it's not a bad image for what we face, unfortunately. If we look at where we expect it to go, you know, you've talked about him having some things that are kind of anti-war and some things that are kind of more militaristic. I think we look at, again, his appointments, and I think we've got to expect to see more U.S. military involvement in conflicts around the world, unfortunately.
It certainly signals that.
Unfortunately.
It certainly signals that. So,
You know, and if we look at places like Israel, where just after the election, you know, they started new housing blocks in the occupied territories. Okay, just one little example of how, oh, we've got a new president who's more sort of, you know, right-wing populist. Probably now we can get away with less concern for the civil and democratic and human rights of the people that we have power over. And unfortunately, I think we have to expect to see more of that around the world.
and actually, you know, we talked about this earlier in terms of the politics that are going on in other countries too. It's certainly trending towards more right-wing, more oligarch-style type leadership. And when you look at what's happening in France, you know, like I say, there's going to be elections in Germany, Great Britain. The question is, how far right are these countries going to go, and what are they going to do? I mean, are they going to expect us to lead in terms of policy, or are they going to be individual players out there now? Because they all seem to be singing from the same hymn book in terms of what they're going to do, how they're going to project themselves to the world.
But what this means is the failure to solve problems.
Yes.
That's what it means. So when we see, you know, we already have more refugees than we've ever had at any time, more displaced people, at least since World War II, around the world today. And, you know, I mean, I don't know where they're going to come from, but I think that if you have to put your money on one side or the other, we're probably going to see more of that.
Yeah.
And we're probably going to see those international institutions whose job it is to address these issues weakened rather than strengthened. And then, you know, part of the problem is that these problems tend to sort of bleed into other areas. So then they'll undermine the legitimacy of a certain government, or they'll push another government to, you know, if there's already a simmering conflict, well, they'll make it more likely that it'll just explode or become more serious. That's the way these things work. So it's a very frightening prospect. We look at the world situation moving forward.
And a lot of it, unfortunately, plays into people like Vladimir Putin's hands.
Yes, it does.
You see, you know, the West destabilized this way.
Right. I mean, we could imagine a scenario where the Cold War situation with the United States and Soviet Union, but now we're talking about United States, Soviet Union, and China, where that type of politics, where we get back to closer to that, you know, with the whole thing of proxy conflicts in various places around the world. And it's not an attractive thought. And, you know, I find myself coming back to the question of, say, well, you know, where does that leave you and I, the citizen? And on the one hand, we need to, I mean, I hope and pray this doesn't happen. Yeah. I hope and pray that he turns out to be a much more far-sighted and thoughtful leader than I expect. But just looking at the evidence, We can't expect
And I
that.
think we'll get some early indications of that when they develop whatever is going to be their policy in Syria. That'll tell us a whole lot about where he's going to go
I
in terms
think
of
the-
use of American
the-
forces.
The first thing is going to be who he appoints as Secretary of State, because as we speak right now, he still hasn't announced who he's going to appoint as Secretary of State. He announced this Marine General, Mad Dog, I can't even think of his last name now, to head up the Pentagon, which is, of course, a violation of a longstanding tradition of having civilian control over the Pentagon, because this guy's only 3 or 4 years removed
Yeah.
from active duty in the Marine Corps. But I think the next choice, and of course Romney has been talked about and others, but no one on the horizon seems to me to suggest that we're going to get the far-sighted, subtle foreign policy that we're going to need from the United States, no matter who gets selected as Secretary of State. But
And so I think we're likely to see increasing militarism. I think we're likely to see increasing threats to civil liberties here in our own country. That we're likely to see the law and order forces continuing to be strengthened relative to the liberties and rights of the individual.
And so there's a lot of echoes of '68 under Nixon, only much more overt,
Right.
because again, there's no filter. So he can say these things and do these things, and that's what he's done all throughout the campaign. So,
I mean, part of the consequence of having a recent general as the Secretary of Defense is the restraining hand that you would expect from someone who's had their whole experience in civilian life. That someone who's grown up in the military, that their instincts are going to be, well, what's the military solution to this problem? And if you look at the broader team that Trump is putting together, you don't see a strong counterweight
No.
to those sorts of instincts.
will we look back on 11/08/2016 as a kind of 9/11 in maybe
in politics, yeah.
in politics?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. People will remember where they were that night and that morning for the rest of their lives. I mean, I've seen it in my workplace. People were literally in shock the next day at work. That's the kind of memory, or what I call it trauma, that will stay with you for a long, long time.
I've even heard the term slow motion coup used to describe what has just happened. Is that too strong a term, do you think, Paul?
Well, I think that movement in a fascist direction that's probably the most accurate political description of what we've seen take place in our country in the last few days. But let's be clear that from a political perspective, a crisis is also an opportunity. That after 9/11, what we saw is, well, that led to the invasion of Iraq. And it was the fears that 9/11 generated that allowed the lies that the Bush administration was telling to be accepted and lead to something like the invasion of Iraq. But who's going to be the primary victim of this election? It's going to be the people of this country. It's going to be our own fellow citizens. And so that then provides the opportunity to say, look, these stories they've been telling you are just a pack of lies. And we have an opportunity to build something different. And it's going to take work. But that's what I think is a substantial difference from the 9/11 image.
And I think Paul Krugman addressed those issues in his column today in the New York Times, where he talked about the deal that the white working class thought they were getting from Trump. They're going to find out down the road that that's not going to be what they're going to get, and they're going to be bitterly disappointed by it. And I think that's going to be at play here as well.
And that's when the Democratic Party has to be ready to provide some kind of an alternative course of action, or we get more of the politics of resentment, we get more of the anger and the hatred and the violence.
I'm going to say we, the Democratic Party, need to be talking to people, here in Kalamazoo. We need to be talking to workers. We need to be talking to teachers, to people who are losing their health insurance. It's got to be grassroots
Yep,
up
has
as
to be
well as
grassroots
top
up.
down. We need it
Yep.
at both ends.
Yep. Has to be.
the day after the election, the Nation put out an issue, and it on the front it said, "Mourn, resist, organize."
Right.
So what's it going to take? I mean, we talked about the role of the Democratic Party. What else is it going to take to resist the trends that we're seeing? I'll ask. We're down to a couple minutes left. So
I think people are going to have to be, as Paul said, more than bystanders. They're going to have to be actual allies at the granular level. Because I think that's where this is going to reverberate the most. And people have to recognize that they literally do have some skin in this game, and that this is a serious game with serious consequences to folks who decide, I'm just going to remain on the sidelines and watch and wait. I don't think we can afford to do that, especially not in the Democratic Party. We have to become allies.
And I think if we look at the 60s and the political activism of the 60s, we haven't seen any kind of percentage involvement of our citizens in sort of day-to-day politics, I think, since that time. But if we don't see that type of mass popular movement, and certainly part of it has to be, I'm going to say, building the Democratic Party, issue by issue, organization by organization, but also what we'll be seeing is, you don't get threats to the environment in general. You don't get, pulling people off their health insurance in general. It's specific things that go wrong. It's specific individuals that lose their health insurance, and we've got to be focusing on those. And sometimes I expect that we'll see a stronger. I don't want to talk about extremism, but it's not going to be extremism. I mean, extreme circumstances call for extreme reactions. I think we're going to see more people coming out onto the streets, and people coming out and saying, this is just not acceptable, and we're going to stand here until you take us away because it's just not right.
yeah. Well, we're out of time, so I hope that this program, Critical Issues Alternative Views, can play a role in helping to mobilize that resistance and that organization that'll be necessary. And we thank you for joining us, and we invite you to come back again on Critical Issues Alternative Views.